Millions of Americans take Tylenol like it's barely even medicine. Headache? Tylenol. Fever? Tylenol. Feeling awful? Probably Tylenol. But here's the real question. What does that pill actually do? Like seriously, how does something you swallow end up dialing down pain in your head? And here's the weird part. Exactly how it relieves pain still isn't fully settled. Even the official Tylenol explanation uses cautious language, phrases like, "It is believed that acetaminophen works by..." For a drug this common, that's surprisingly careful wording. So let's break this down. What we know, what we still don't fully know, and why Tylenol became one of the most trusted everyday drugs in America. And once you understand that, you'll also understand why taking too much of it can become dangerous faster than most people realize. First, quick translation. Tylenol is the brand name. The actual drug is acetaminophen. If you're outside the US, it usually goes by paracetamol. Same molecule, different passport. And in America, this stuff is everywhere. Headaches, fevers, cold meds, flu meds, the whole "I still have to function today" category of suffering. Tylenol is one of those drugs that feels less like a medication and more like part of the furniture. But the story of how it got there is stranger than most people realize. Go back to 1886 in Strasbourg, then part of the German Empire. A physician named Adolf Kussmaul and his assistants, Arnold Kahn and Paul Hepp, were trying to treat a patient for intestinal worms using naphthalene. But the pharmacy made a mistake. Instead of naphthalene, they sent a different chemical, acetanolide. The worms apparently were not impressed, but the patient's fever dropped. That accident helped launch one of the earliest modern fever reducers. Later, scientists figured out that acetaminophen was one of the cleaner ways to get the fever and pain-relieving effect people wanted. So in a weird way, Tylenol's history starts the same way its science still feels. People noticed that something worked long before they could explain it neatly. And that's where this gets more interesting, because what acetaminophen seems to do inside the body, especially inside the brain, is not what most people expect from a drug this ordinary. To understand why Tylenol is so weird, we need to separate two things most people mix together: pain and inflammation. They often travel together, but they are not the same thing. Inflammation is what happens at the scene. Your ankle swells, your throat gets irritated, a muscle feels hot, tight, and angry. Pain is the message that gets sent upstairs. Something in your body gets irritated, stressed, injured, or inflamed, and your nerves send that warning signal to the brain. But here's the important part. The strength of that signal can be turned up or down. One of the chemical systems involved in that process is a group of molecules called prostaglandins. They help make pain feel stronger, help drive inflammation, and also play a role in fever. And your body makes prostaglandins with the help of enzymes called COX enzymes. That matters because drugs like ibuprofen work by blocking COX enzymes more broadly throughout the body. Less COX activity means fewer prostaglandins. And fewer prostaglandins usually means less inflammation, less pain, and lower fever. That is why ibuprofen can be especially useful when the problem feels physically inflamed, like a swollen ankle, a sore muscle, or something that feels irritated at the source. But because ibuprofen works broadly, it can also affect places you did not mean to target. It can irritate the stomach, affect blood clotting, and come with other side effects. In other words, ibuprofen can work very well, it just works with a wider blast radius. And Tylenol is different. And this is where Tylenol quietly breaks the pattern most people expect from a painkiller. Rather than strongly blocking that system all over the body, Tylenol appears to act mainly in the central nervous system, especially the brain and spinal cord. So if ibuprofen is like sending a repair crew out to the scene, Tylenol is more like stepping into the control room and changing how the signal gets handled. That difference explains a lot. It helps explain why Tylenol can work well for many headaches and fevers, but usually does much less for swelling. If your ankle is swollen to the size of a softball, Tylenol may help with the pain, but it is not doing much to calm the inflammation itself. That's one of the biggest practical differences between Tylenol and NSAIDs, like ibuprofen. A fever works in a similar way. It's not just your body overheating by accident, it's your brain raising the body's temperature set point on purpose. In other words, your body is being told to run hotter. Tylenol helps bring that set point back down, which is why it can make you feel dramatically better, even though it's not acting like a classic anti-inflammatory drug in the rest of the body. So here's the rough summary so far. Ibuprofen is more about reducing inflammatory chemistry out in the body. Tylenol seems to work more centrally, changing how pain and temperature are processed. And yes, this is why people can feel weirdly loyal to one over the other. For some Americans, Tylenol versus Advil is practically a personality trait. But if Tylenol mainly works in the brain, the obvious next question is, what exactly is it doing there? This is where things get a little weird. The simple version is that Tylenol seems to turn down pain mainly inside the brain and spinal cord. But it may not do that through one single clean pathway. After your body processes acetaminophen, some of its effects may come from other compounds made along the way. One of those compounds is called AM404, which sounds less like medicine and more like a Wi-Fi password, but it may matter a lot here. And this is why Tylenol is still such an interesting drug scientifically. In plain English, Tylenol may be turning down pain in more than one place, partly by changing chemical signals in the brain, partly through metabolites like AM404, and partly by changing how strongly your nervous system reacts to the pain message. So instead of picturing Tylenol as one switch, picture it more like a dimmer board, not one magic button. More like several small dials being adjusted just enough to make the pain feel less intense. That is probably the best way to understand why this drug feels both familiar and unfinished. We know enough to explain what it generally does. We just do not have every part of the mechanism mapped perfectly yet. And honestly, that is part of what makes Tylenol so strange. It works well for something whose full story still is not completely tidy. But the part we do understand very clearly is the part that matters most if you use Tylenol casually, which is exactly how most people use it. Your liver is the organ that has to deal with Tylenol after you take it. Most of the time, that goes completely fine. Your body processes it, clears it out, and everybody moves on. But a small amount gets turned into a toxic byproduct called NAPQI. Normally, that's still not a problem because your body neutralizes it with something called glutathione, basically the built-in cleanup system. As long as there's enough of that around, the dangerous byproduct gets handled. The problem starts when you take too much Tylenol. At that point, the safe pathways get overwhelmed, glutathione gets depleted, and that toxic compound starts building up. That's when liver damage can happen. And this is not just some weird medical edge case. One of the biggest reasons acetaminophen overdose happens is because it is hiding in so many combination products. You take Tylenol for a headache, then cold medicine, then maybe something to help you sleep, and suddenly you've stacked multiple doses without noticing. That's part of what makes Tylenol deceptively risky. Not because it's a bad drug, but because it feels so normal that people stop thinking of it as something that still needs to be tracked. And this is where the label matters. The boring habit that matters most is checking the active ingredient line. If it says acetaminophen or APAP, count it toward your total for the day. Because sometimes the bottle does not scream Tylenol. It says cold relief, flu relief, nighttime relief, sinus relief, or prescription pain medicine. But if acetaminophen is in there, your liver still has to process it. So the big takeaway is not that Tylenol is bad. It's that Tylenol is easy to underestimate. It feels harmless because it is familiar. But familiar is not the same thing as risk-free. That's why the rule with Tylenol is simple. More is not better, and blindly mixing products is a terrible strategy. If you have liver disease, regularly drink alcohol, or are taking multiple medications, that matters even more, because with Tylenol, the biggest danger often does not come from one dramatic decision. It comes from casually stacking normal choices that do not seem connected. So yes, Tylenol is one of the most trusted everyday drugs in America. It works, it helps, and it absolutely deserves its place in the medicine cabinet. But it is also stranger than it looks. It is a drug most people never think twice about, even though scientists are still untangling exactly how it works, and doctors have been warning for years about what happens when people take too much without realizing it. Tylenol is not scary because it is rare or mysterious. It is risky for the opposite reason. It is so familiar that people stop counting it. And with this drug, counting is the difference between help and harm. So now I want to hear from you. Did any part of this change how you think about Tylenol? And be honest, are you Team Tylenol, Team Ibuprofen, or the type of person who just takes whatever is closest in the cabinet? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because sometimes the most ordinary things in your house are the ones you should understand best.